Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Engagers, welcome to another episode of Professor Game Podcast. And today we have Brian with us. But Brian, before we get started, we need to know, this is very, very important. Are you prepared to engage?
I am definitely prepared to engage. Yes, sir.
Let's do this, because Brian Collins, he began his fascinating and unique career as a, don't lose your attention here. He was a Walt Disney Imagineer, where he helped create the magic for Disney's Florida theme parks before going on to produce for a who's who list of corporations and small entrepreneurial ventures. Of course, along the way, he became a passionate educator. He is serving as an adjunct professor at several schools as an innovation specialist for online education. Later in his career, he developed a deep understanding of new and emerging technologies and, most importantly, how to apply to business, military, and in learning environments. He's also considered somewhat of an expert in the area, being, exploring the most exotic sci-fi tech that's out there or coming to be or on the way. He is also a sought-after innovation consultant through his practice, which is known as the Brainstorm Institute, and where he combines his design thinking skills and, of course, his technology know-how with a strategic business acumen, which enables him to offer creative design, planning experiences for his clients. And he is the head of VR simulations and strategic initiatives, the premier game design and content creation studio, Magic Bytes. His focus is to make sure the company stays at the forefront of innovation by making sure their team leverages the latest and most relevant XR, VR gaming design technologies available. He is an accomplished speaker. He's often interviews in podcasts, like, of course, Professor Game. We were just talking about the fact that he's just coming out of another interview as well. And he's available to deliver, of course, keynote addresses, lectures, workshops, and other corporate or conference presentation. And he is in Orlando, Florida. In these days of coronavirus, where you are in the world is very, very relevant as well. And he is, of course, enjoying serving his clients for all around the world. Is there anything, Brian, that anything we should know, any additional details that are not said in such an intro?
That guy sounds like really interesting. I can't wait to hear what he has to say.
Sounds like a good person, right?
Yeah. Wow.
So, Brian, we know what you're doing now. We kind of have an idea of what your world looks like. Can you tell us, what does, a regular day, what does your schedule look like? If we were going to be with you for a day, what would that typically look like?
These days it's really interesting. I've been spending a lot of focus in the virtual world out there, places like OffSpace, for example, looking at how I can maybe take those technologies in gaming environments and kind of adapt them to new audiences for, let's say, education or corporate training or whatever it may be. I love to just kind of tinker and be in the know of new technologies that are kind of coming out there. So I spend a lot of time, perusing the internet or reading articles or things like that, just to try and stay on top of that stuff.
That sounds super, super cool.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. So, Brian, we like to know, who you are, what your day consists of, but we also are very, very particularly interested in knowing of a story of failure. And why? Because we learn a lot from failure. So we want to be there in that fail moment, that first attempt at learning with you. Can you tell us a story of, again, whether it was creating one of your Imagineer moments or whether it was creating games and gamification, a time when, again, you struggled, you managed to make it through or not, and what were, of course, the lessons from such a trip?
That's kind of an interesting question, and I've gotten it a few times. And what I will tell you is that I think my biggest challenges in my career have been there are a lot of times where either it's been my job or just my nature, if you will, to kind of stay on top of these emerging technologies, new things that are coming out that are really on the bleeding edge. And a lot of times I think it can be very, very challenging when you're out there to try and convince people that these technologies are not just a passing fad, that there really is some merit to them. I remember one time when I was working as a innovation specialist at the virtual school here in Florida. I remember at one point I was looking at how we could take telematics, which is in-car technology that was being developed. And this is probably about a dozen or so years ago, 10, 12 years ago. And I was exploring, can we take that in-car technology and deliver educational content to the students in the vehicles? And I remember I was meeting with some representatives from some of the big car manufacturers. And while they found it really intriguing, I don't think they really kind of understood exactly where I was kind of going with that and how their car technology could be used for education. And now, as that technology has evolved, I think a lot of them are kind of starting to kind of come around and it would be a lot easier sell. But for me, I think that's my biggest challenge. Even now, when I mentioned that I'm looking at how to use virtual worlds for education, there are a lot of people who are very apprehensive and very reticent to want to adopt those technologies because they think they're a little bit too complicated or there will be too many technical problems or whatever. That's why it's so important for me to understand as much as I can about them so that when these kind of concerns come up, I can address them and hopefully put people's mind at ease and kind of keep them on the forefront of that technology.
What would you say, after, of course, you've had this experience, it seems more than once, what would you say is a key lesson from you when, of course, and this happens with technology, with approaches like gamification, at some point game design thinking as well? Like, is there something that you have learned throughout these difficult times that you say, well, how would you how are you approaching it differently nowadays that, of course, helps you get that 1%, 10%, 50% or whatever percent a little bit better, get a little bit better response, get your clients and your collaborators to understand it better and perhaps even, include it in their projects?
I think a lot of it has to do with making sure that you understand the business that you're working for, pitching to, if you will, and knowing how to make those technologies relevant to them and to kind of take the mystery, if you will, out of it. For those of us that work in gamification every day, and work in innovation and work on these new and emerging technologies, it almost becomes very second nature way of us thinking. But you forget that most people aren't in that world like we are. And a lot of times new technology like that can be very, very frightening and nerve-wracking, especially, when people have to invest money into something that hasn't been done before or is a brand new kind of technology. So being able to break it down for them in very easy to understand language, I think is super, super important. And being as specific as you can to the relevance to them is very important.
Absolutely. In fact, it is just, and I saw you're an adjunct professor as well. Yeah. It's just like teaching. You have to understand a concept very, very deeply to be able to, show it as well to others and be able to simplify it, actually, to make it look simple so that other people are able to understand it. So you can explain it to, your grandma or, whomever you think is somebody that would have a hard time understanding that, right?
Yeah, yeah. Even my partner at Magic Bytes that I work with, founder of the company, he was a rock star back in the early 80s of game design and was very, very successful and understands gaming incredibly well and is a very innovative thinker. But there are times where I'll come to him with an idea that is outside of that box, and a little bit outside the comfort zone. And trying to, be able to convince them that I'm not just, going on a wild goose chase or going down a rabbit hole, that I think there may be something to this application, this new way of applying the technology, which is one thing we love to do. Even for someone, who has that huge background in gaming, it's a little bit of a task sometimes to get them to shift their mind into a new adaptation or a new way of thinking.
New is always difficult.
Yeah.
Change is something that we always definitely struggle with.
Yeah. But, and a lot of people are scared of it, but, that's where I live and I love it, and I wouldn't want it to be any other way. That's where the biggest breakthroughs come.
Absolutely. And talking about breakthroughs, we want to go for another story of a time actually that you set out to do. You set out for one of those breakthroughs and you actually achieved it. We want to be there in that success with you. We want to be there and understand what made it successful for you and how would you what would you assign that percentage of success to? Are there any one, maybe two or three things that you say, well, I think we did these things very, very well, and this is something that we're trying to do as well in the future?
I keep going back to education, projects I worked on in education, only because those were some of the most fun projects that I had. And one in particular, I remember, I wanted to develop a 3D frog dissection, right, for our school, our virtual school, because he likes going into a lab, and smelling that formaldehyde and getting out the scalpel and doing all that. It's not everyone's favorite day at school when that day comes. And when you're taking lessons through virtual school, how are you supposed to do that? So I wanted to come up with this really innovative frog dissection. So what we did was we turned it into a game. It was a frog dissection game, if you will. And not only did we gamify it, but I had been doing some research in different kinds of 3D techniques, and there are a lot of different techniques out there to achieve 3D. You can do it through the old red and blue lenses like they did at the old movies. You can do it with polarized lenses, which is kind of how they do it now at the theme parks and things like that. But I actually started looking into this 3D technique called chroma depth, which is based on the color palette that you use for your designing your images. And the cool thing about chroma depth is that when you look at your images without the glasses, they look perfectly normal. So you would never know, like a lot of 3D techniques, when you take the glasses off, it's all blurry. But with chroma depth, you can look at the images, they're perfectly normal, then you put the glasses on, and it pops out in 3D. It's quite a lot of fun, and it was very, very applicable for this because, 3D isn't necessarily for everyone. And when we were trying to create this frog dissection, obviously it's important, since it was going to be part of the curriculum in the lesson, that everyone was able to participate. So they could participate if they wanted with the glasses or without. But those glasses just kind of helped give it an extra little bit of zing, if you will, a little excitement, and made it very, very fun. So that's a project that I really had a good time with and was very, very successful.
Well, it seems like this time one of the key components was actually technology. This is not always a very common theme, I have to say. Pretty often it is about, design choices. And this was a design choice, but, catered towards technology. And from what you say, one of the things I hear is the fact that you thought about this and how to apply it, how to use it for this specific audience, right, thinking that some people will be able to have the glasses, some people won't be able to have the glasses, and that is okay. They are able to do it in both ways, and that is actually a smart decision to take in such circumstances.
Yeah, for sure. And
so, Brian, sorry, you were going to finish with something.
I was going to say, and then, when you added the gamification of the dissection on top of that, it just made it that much more fun and approachable for the students.
Absolutely, absolutely. And talking about, adding gamification or including gamification as a strategy, as a design, we know you have as well your experience at Walt Disney as an Imagineer. Yeah. So we want to pull from all that awesome experience that you've had for so many years as well, and understand, like, when you're facing a project and you want to insert fun, you want to use gamification, you're using your mind as an Imagineer. Do you follow some sort of process, maybe something you took again from those years? Maybe there's something that's a mix from what you've been doing then and now. How do you approach these projects? How do you think of it? Like, what are your steps, your framework? How do you approach these things?
That's actually really kind of an interesting question. So when I first went to work for Disney was early on in my career, and one of the things that I took away from that is how important it is to develop it and create a story around your project. Everything we did at Disney as an Imagineer in particular has to do about building that story. And when I talk about story, it's not necessarily like a storybook like Once Upon a Time, that kind of a story, but it's more about the background and the theme and the feel of whatever the ride, the attraction that I was working on. Even sometimes, just a simple plaque that was going into a themed environment. how all of that fit into the overall story that we were trying to tell. And that's something that has kind of stayed with me my entire career is when I start a new project, I always try and frame it within a bigger story. I try to, sometimes it can be a story in the literal sense. I'm working on Magic Bytes right now. We're creating a couple really kind of fun VR games for headsets like Oculus and things like that. And before we even start diving into like the programming and the design, at least for me, it's very important to come up with the overall story arc of what we're doing and to be able to use that kind of as like the blueprint that then our programmers and designers and artists and musicians can then use to kind of carry that project through to the end. It really kind of helps give them a more clear vision of what the overall...
Absolutely. Yeah. And sorry to jump in. Do you have any strategy when how do you pick that theme? How do you that theme, that narrative, that storyline? How do you go about it?
Boy.
Again, try to be as generic as you can, but if you have to use specific examples as well, they're welcome.
Yeah, I think, a big part of it is just kind of understanding who your audience is and who your demographic is that you're going to be writing for. And then, sometimes the theme of the story is going to help, or the theme of the project is going to kind of help drive that story very naturally. So, for example, if we're doing a STEM-based project that takes place on a spaceship, on a space station, that's going to certainly draw one kind of narrative. On the other hand, another game might be music-based and understanding different genres of music. So understanding, I guess, the direction that the project is going to be taking and then who the audience is, who you're creating for, I think those are the two key things that you need to really kind of understand. And then from that, you can draft your storyline.
Absolutely. And once we've dived into that storyline, you thought about your audience, you found a theme that makes sense for this audience, for this project. What is it you do next? Do you dive directly into, how do you do that sort of design? You have the story and then maybe what would happen? What would be the next step?
I think some of it is going to be certainly talking with the technical side, the tech team, to have an understanding of how the game is going to be executed and what the features are that we'll be able to build into it. As you know, when you get into like game design, for example, there's so many variables that come with what you can design into a project. And that can be limited by budget, by the talents of your artistic team, the talents of your design team. So I think having a really good understanding of the people who are going to build that project, it's kind of like, the architect who may go out there and design this beautiful, gorgeous building, but then it's the engineers that have to make it work, right? So it's kind of like the same thing. You can come up with a great story, but you want to make sure that whatever that story and that creative direction is going to be something that they'll be able to execute.
Would it be possible, Brian, I don't know if I'm asking too much, but it would be possible for you to run us, like, for example, you did this for X, or you don't have to name any names, like, oh, we did this, we found out our users were like this and like that. Yeah. We created this type of story, and then we designed a game in which, the players were doing this and that. Like, can you run us through an example of that? Because it seems very, very interesting.
I can, and actually I'll go back to my Disney Imagineering days, not necessarily for a game, but for an attraction. One of the marquee attractions in Florida at the Disney, now it's the Disney Hollywood Studios, but it used to be called Disney MGM Studios. There used to be a very large attraction there called the Great Movie Ride. And if any of your listeners have ever been on that, I'll tell you very quickly the premise of the ride was that you would get on a ride vehicle and it would take you through different scenes of different Hollywood classic movies. And you would see audio animatronics from like Mary Poppins and Singing in the Rain and Casablanca and The Wizard of Oz. And at one point, as you're going through the ride, your ride vehicle would be hijacked by either a gangster character or a Western cowboy character, cowgirl. They would take over your ride vehicle and take you through the attraction for a little bit. So I was asked to go in and kind of update that attraction and update the scripting a little bit and do some work in there. And one of the things that I did was I actually wrote backstories for each of those characters, for the Western character and the gangster character, and even for the tour guide who, if you think about it, your tour guide was a character as well. These backstories weren't anything that the guests would ever see, but they were written specifically for the cast members that played those parts. And the whole reason for that was to be able to give those to any person that was coming into the role so that they could understand the history. And it was stuff like the gangster, used to run whiskey with Al Capone during Prohibition and used to scam tourists and, was a pickpocket, and the Western character got on the wrong side of the law and, all this really in-depth detail about them. It was a lot of fun. And the whole idea for that was to just kind of get their mind in the right perspective of who those characters were, so that when they perform the role, they would be able to do it more consistently no matter who was doing it. So I think, that's an example where sometimes you have to go into a lot of detail into maybe those backstories and, just think below the surface of what, if it's a game that you're designing characters, for a video game or a console game, let's say, you want to understand who your characters are, at least your main characters are, and what their motivations are. So that was something that, we were trained to do at Disney as part of being able to tell that story.
That sounds amazing and gives like an idea of the level of depth that these kinds of attractions have to get into really be as incredible as they are. I was with my wife at Disney Florida actually like a year ago by now. And it's absolutely amazing. I've been there a few times before. It was the first time for my wife. She was absolutely amazed. We had a great time. But these kinds of story let us know the level of deep understanding, the level of importance that is provided to all these things for these, for these stories, for all these things to happen the way they do, and for them to be that sort of magic that some people experience when going to the park.
Yeah. For sure. There's just so much that, people wouldn't think of or that they never see that goes on behind the scenes. It's an amazingly creative environment to be in. I will tell you that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just a quick break before we continue with this episode. If you've been enjoying this podcast, I would really appreciate if you share it with your friends and family and on social media. On Twitter and Instagram, it's @RobAlvarezB and the hashtag Professor Game, all one word. And in Facebook, you can find the Professor Game page. Thanks in advance for your engagement. And Brian, what would you say is when creating these experiences, when creating these games or any of the above, when you're doing that, would you say that there is some sort of best practice, something that when you consider it, when you do this kind of thing, this strategy, this idea, it would probably help you improve that project? It would be a good, again, a best practice perhaps.
For me, I think a lot of it is having what I call a full mental filing cabinet, kind of, being a student of the world, kind of observing, what's going on around you. There's kind of a martial arts term I talk about from the martial art of Aikido that's called soft eyes. Soft eyes is the concept of being aware of what's going on around you, but not necessarily being focused. And I think the best creative people, the best storytellers are those that kind of have mastered that concept of being able to look at a pattern in a carpet or something in nature or a sound they hear, and they kind of tuck it away in their brain, not knowing when they may use it, but just knowing at some point it's going to be something that they're going to need, and it'll come back to serve them well. And the more stuff that you can kind of keep in that mental filing cabinet of yours, I think the better you're going to be at being able to come up with creative or innovative solutions to, a project, a story, whatever it may be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, this reminds me of one of the first interviews we had with Marigo Raftopoulos, who is a researcher and does gamification, game design for quite some time. And one of the things that she was saying is that she has found in her research when looking at game designers that one of the things that game designers do is look at a life itself.
Yeah.
Just be observing what's happening out there, in the wild, so to speak, where we're actually living. And then that's what they actually incorporate into the game, so that there is that level of familiarity that you can work with. And then when you think of gamification is usually looking at what games and game designers are doing to translate it into something that is not necessarily a game.
Right.
So again, maybe you can jump a part of that step, or also look a little bit further ahead. And as you were suggesting, definitely take a look at what's happening, in the world out there. And I think it is an exciting world that we live in. And there's a lot of inspiration to gain from that. So I love that answer, Brian.
Thank you. Yeah.
So after listening to these things, I know you heard a couple of interviews as well. Is there somebody you say, well, I would also like to listen to this other person in Professor Game, some guest that you would perhaps suggest?
Yeah, there's so many people I find interesting out there. There's a lot going on right now in artificial intelligence studies, and people like Kurzweil, who does a lot of stuff on artificial intelligence. I'm just really fascinated by where that whole area of research is going right now and how that's going to be impacting our lives. They talk a lot about our computers going to become sentient someday. And when, I've had the chance to go to, some military conferences on technology and simulation, and you see the stuff that's being worked on out there. It's just amazing. So that's definitely, if you find anyone that's kind of an expert in that field of artificial intelligence, that would be wonderful.
Absolutely. It sounds like a very interesting thing to maybe even relate back to these experiences, these interactive experiences, these games, and gamified experiences as well. It could be very, very useful and interesting also. And again, talking about recommendations, is there any book that you recommend an audience like this one, like the Engagers, people who are thinking of using games for, whatever purposes they may be, educational, other business purposes as well? Is there a book that you would recommend for that, again, for inspiration, direct inspiration, or something related?
One of my favorite books that I recommend is probably a book by Marty Sklar, who used to be the president of Disney Imagineering, called One Little Spark. He wrote a book, One Little Spark. And it's a wonderful book that talks not only about his experiences as an Imagineer, but about the process that Imagineers use to, when they're taking on a new project. In that book, you'll find Mickey's 10 Commandments, and things like that. Great read, really fun, easy read, and very inspiring.
Sounds very exciting, definitely. And now, moving away from recommendations on books and people, this is kind of a recommendation as well, because we would like to know, what is your favorite game?
So you're probably going to laugh at me. The game that I've got the most fondest memories of, and I'm going to be going old school on you, but when my kids were young, especially my two boys, we used to sit around and play the old James Bond 007 games on the Nintendo 64.
N64.
Yeah.
Legendary.
Yeah. And boy, I just, to this day, I play a lot of, more advanced games and stuff, but those games to me still rank high up there as some of my favorite games.
Absolutely. You might want to take a look at it if you like that game. And I definitely enjoyed it very, very much. I had it on my own N64 back in the day.
Yeah.
You might want to check out what Fortnite is doing. Definitely is different, in the sense that it's more upfront. In 007, you were, the covert agent, and many times your missions, you could either approach them as full out blasts.
Yeah,
many times you just couldn't even do that. And the multiplayer was sort of full out blast as well.
Yeah.
But Fortnite has some elements of that, and, some quirkiness and some fun. There's a mission I've been playing these days. It's kind of a different mode in which you are like part of a team and you have to gather some secret files from the other team. You never get to know what the files are even about. You just have to capture it and bring it to your base, and they have to do the same afterwards. But it kind of, you mentioning that and me having played that recently as well brought me like these two things together. And maybe it's something you want to check out. It's for free on phones. Very difficult to play on your phone. I don't know how many kids manage to do that nowadays. I definitely don't manage to do it very well, but I've tried it as well on my console, and it's actually it's actually pretty great.
I got to tell you, it's kind of funny, me being such a supposedly technologically innovative person that I am. The thing I loved about the N64 were that the controllers were easy to use, and the controllers for any game today, which most of your audience has probably grown up with, so they probably won't even, be able to relate to what I'm saying, but, there's so many buttons and controls and stuff on them that I think I would probably dislocate my fingers trying to master any of, some of the more popular games today.
Well, if you've mastered N64, I would argue that the controllers after that of Nintendo haven't changed that much to this day. Like the Switch nowadays is not super complicated at all.
Okay.
And there's different sort of modalities of the controller itself. And, PlayStation certainly has like more buttons or sort of feels like there's more buttons, but it's, again, the distance is not that far away. Yeah. Like the trigger button that you had on the 007, there's still a trigger button. The difference is that there's another trigger button. Okay. So there's two.
All right.
In a way, but anyways, we've been, having a lot of fun here, and I want to know, and again, take this question wherever you want to. I'd like to know, what would you consider is, as an Imagineer, as a gamifier, what would you say is your superpower? What's that thing that you do great that you think, is one of your basic and main abilities?
You know what? I love being able to connect the dots in ways that other people can't. I'd say that's my superpower. So I would say being able to maybe look at a technology and figuring out how to apply it in a different new way, looking at a game that's being developed and coming up with some kind of maybe surprise or different angle that hadn't been thought of before. That's what I like to do. I really like to kind of find, 2 or 3 things that most people wouldn't think have anything to do with each other and find a way to bring them together into my projects. That's what I try and do in Magic Bytes all the time, and even outside of my work. It's I don't know, kind of keeps me mentally going. So.
Absolutely. In fact, I've heard, I don't know if it's a formal definition or not, of innovation is precisely putting two things. A way of doing innovation is getting two things that work, in separate worlds. And when you put them together, there's something new.
Yeah.
Because they weren't doing the original things that they were doing. And then you're not necessarily inventing, the iPhone or that kind of thing. You're just, actually the iPhone in a way was the combination of other things put together as well. So that's definitely what I would argue innovation is almost all about.
Yeah, for sure.
So Brian, we're running out of time, but I don't want to go before leaving you an extra minute or so. If you want to have any final words and a final piece of advice, also, of course, tell us where we can find more about, Magic Bytes, about Brian in general. If we want to reach out to you, and after that, before, get into this before we actually say that it's game over.
Okay. Well, listen, I'm easy to find on social media for sure. So on LinkedIn, you can just probably search for Brian Collins Orlando and you'll find me. You can find me on Facebook. I've got a Facebook page called The Mouse and the Imagineer, and another one for educators, if there are any teachers out there, or educators, called Educators Who Love Disney. Magic Bytes, certainly go to magicbytes.com. Learn about all the wonderful, amazing stuff that we're doing. And a shameless plug, but if anyone needs any wonderful content for gaming or anything else out there, I'd love to hear from you. Email me at brian@magicbytes.com. I'm on Twitter. So yeah, find me, follow me, and that'd be awesome. I love hearing from people.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Brian, for this investment of time you did today with us with the Engagers. However, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over.
Game over.
Hey, Engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast. And if you want more interviews with incredible guests like our own Disney Imagineer, Brian Collins, then please go to professorgame.com/subscribe and get started on our email list if you haven't already. We can be in contact and you'll be the first to know of opportunities, episodes, readings, and so much more that Professor Game that we might have for you. And before you go into your next mission, remember to subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.